Well, that was a great lecture by Dr. Nara. I wished I'd had that about 20 or 30 years ago, because it was a lot shorter than all the lectures I had to learn about that. But I'd like to thank Jared and Bonnie for inviting me here to speak. They gave me the topic, so I would like to at least disclose that I'm not really a future predictor or anything like that, but you know, I do know a few things about Yellowstone bison. And I've kind of followed the journey for quite a while. I know a lot about how they recovered from an isolated population of just a couple dozen animals in the interior of the park. And in 130 years, you know, we've got a pretty large dispersed population throughout at least the park area. So I had to include my Groundhog Day poster, because for many years I hung a poster like that in my office, and it did seem like I'd wake up and go to work every day. It was the same old thing. But the reality is there have been some slow and steady progress, you know, over the years. So I got a fair number of things to share with you today. Let's see here. Oh yeah. So the future really is here right now. From my perspective, I think that you're seeing what bison conservation will be like in the foreseeable future, unless we as the citizens of Montana collectively provide our state leadership with a vision for the future that's markedly different. And so it's up to us, you know, to communicate with the state and say what we want to happen. I think Yellowstone's gone as far as they can go to advance the restoration of the population. It's my opinion that the state of Montana is not really engaged in any meaningful way regarding conservation of wild bison. And this, I'm sure, is not the first time you've heard that. I saw it in the movie there. So Montana policy really appears like elk is good and bison's bad, and we've heard that for so long. I'd like to see us come up with a way to change that. When you talk to many of the people in state leadership, they refer to wild bison as park bison, when in reality, they're really a public trust resource, and they're held in trust for all of you. Whenever they go into the state of Montana, that trust responsibility falls to the state. And I think we need to do something different. The state, as far as I can tell, and I'm reading a lot of the history books, has never wanted Yellowstone bison to migrate out of the park and into Montana. And I can reference, I saw in the record, the administrative record that the agencies keep on their website, that a couple years ago in a meeting, the Department of Livestock and Fish, Wildlife and Parks, they were very much lockstep in stating in a public meeting that they preferred a stable or decreasing population abundance. And I think that their concern is based on, they don't feel like the Department of Livestock has enough resources to go out and manage bison. And they referenced this tolerance zone, and we've been battling the idea of a tolerance zone for quite a long time, and it's possible that it would be better to just drop the whole zone concept. So I think that that's basically a statement of pest management rather than a conservation of native wildlife like we all appreciate. And it's a perspective rooted in their zero tolerance policy, and that zero tolerance policy is decades old. Rather than manage wild bison for their distribution throughout the whole area that they have available, Montana leadership prefers to limit bison to a much smaller area. Oh, darn it. Where did my map go? There we go. So I need to at least explain a few locations here, and a little bit of that has come to light already. I'm going to see if I can use the stress meter here. The town of Gardner is right about here, and this Yellowstone River along in through here was once the border of the area that Montana said they'd be allowed to go if they left the national park. And it was a real thin area, real close to the Yellowstone River. And then in 2015, that area was expanded to the whole Gardner Basin, the area that the water drains down into the Yellowstone River there, south of Yankee Jim Canyon. And you've saw all that work around beady gulch. That little star represents where the hunt area is, and it's kind of where the bison migration collides with management actions by the hunters at the boundary. Stephanie's program talked about the trap, and it's a little bit inside the park, and that, like she said, is a strategic location for catching them in the migration. But you can see that it's a real small area compared to the many acres available. On the west side, it's very similar. This little red line right here identifies the area established in the negotiated settlement of 2000 that bison were allowed to roam outside the park. Includes the Horse Butte Peninsula. The star represents kind of the major egress site where the animals migrate out of the park and encounter the chance to spread out. But the reality is, in 2015, the state offered, and I don't have the line exactly right, I think it's supposed to stay on the north side of the lake and go up through here and kind of through the west side of the Cabin Creek Wildlife Management Area. But it does include the Taylor Fork, Buffalo Horn Valley. It's a very large area, and you can see that the area that they utilize mostly is minuscule compared to what the state has agreed to allow bison to roam throughout. So talking about wild bison is a very difficult thing for a lot of people to do, for the public, for the managers. I think that it stems from a lot of the myth and misperception and assumptions that go into play, and all about how threatening bison are to the lives of people living in Montana. And that's all a matter of opinion. So I learned to live with bison in the Gardner Basin for 17 years. I think it's pretty easy to do. Many of my neighbors in Gardner were able to. They really love living around bison. You ask most of the people that live around West Yellowstone, they've learned how to do it. The real crux of it is this is a bipolar issue, and that people are either passionately for or passionately against conservation of wild bison. Now, is there any chance of changing the future? I really hope so. I think that there's an opportunity. It's going to take a while, and it's not going to happen this winter. The solution to change, I think, is up to the citizens of Montana, and we need to band together and stand up and communicate well with the leaders of Montana and especially the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department. I think the best actions that have benefited wild bison in the recent past have been that enormous, change in small number of acres to large number of acres. They just haven't had a chance to occupy that larger area. Additionally, I think Fish, Wildlife, and Parks plays a key role. They conducted a multi-year planning process and engaged the public about what is possible in Montana. And they showed that they can do those difficult discussions. They know how to talk about it. They also learned and released an analysis of options that included a great deal of citizen support for wild bison. And so how did that happen? Well, at the time, the citizens elected a governor that was very much aware of the fact that there's a lot of people in Montana that would like to see wild bison reoccupy areas suitable to them. And there was also a Regional 3 supervisor here in Bozeman that was very good at public engagement and moving along that particular process and understood that huge amount of interest by the general public. I do think that the key to responsible governance is to seek the greatest good for the greatest number of citizens, and I'm not seeing it happen right now. I've always thought that FWP was handicapped by the 1995 legislation that redirected the Department of Livestock to be the lead agency for managing Yellowstone bison. So when the current administration put a block on the FWP plan, it shows that the political influence in Helena has a very overwhelming thumb on our state wildlife management agency. So here it is, Jared. I told you I'd reference. Now I would like to share my perspective and where we have come, how we could possibly continue the successful restoration of wild bison in the Yellowstone area. So since wildlife move freely across jurisdictional boundaries, management responsibilities are shared among state, federal agencies. Conflicts arise due to differing mandates and management philosophies. And wild bison are a classic. It's not the only species that we have some of these same issues with, though. With respect to brucellosis, the stakes are high, very high, and it's a very cutthroat atmosphere that arises regarding the wildness and conservation of this species, and it's pitted against the livelihood of an industry and a way of life. Ultimately, the conflict resolves around the cultural values of all sides of the debate, the ecology and the capacity of the system, and the economic drivers of the area. And all of these tend towards a political agenda, like I've heard in virtually every other speaker. And it's really a win at all costs and not a compromise. Bison as a species is a significant player in the history and the prehistory of humans. They were a vital prey for animals throughout Europe and Russia, and it's depicted very well in ancient societies by their graphics on the rock cliffs. Many parts of the bison are utilized to make human lives more comfortable, and it's been that way since the beginning. Bison are a part of our native wildlife legacy, along with elk, with pronghorn, with grizzly bears, with wolves, and any other iconic species that we spend time and effort to conserve in modern society. So my background includes 17 years as the team leader of the Bison Ecology Program at the park. I retired from that position 6 years ago, but I have been able to follow the debate. You can too. There's a website that keeps track of all the decision documents. All of that data that Jared put up earlier, I'm sure came right off of that website. Chris just put out a recent status report for the population with this year's counts, the whole works. So it's easy to follow. I've been following it since I was a student here at Montana State University in the mid-1980s. I followed it as a biologist in Grand Teton National Park early in my career. It's an interesting story, and the struggles to be expressed. The interagency group and the tribes, they collaborate, they debate, and they put out all that information for everybody to study. I want you to at least spend the time to understand the record and not fall prey to all of the myths that actually get propagated all the time. So Yellowstone bison have come far, securing their place in our greater Yellowstone ecosystem in the last century and a quarter. The United States Army was the first entity to realize they needed help. They needed a great deal of help. So they appropriated a $10,000 project fund from Congress, began the program in 1901, brought 21 animals to the park. They spread them out on the northern range. Put them on the northern range, and ultimately they ended up out in the Lamar Valley, and they grew from there. Through a lot of protection and encouragement, the population grew, and the National Park Service deliberately pushed those animals up in the hills to the south to introduce them to the native herd. And that native herd spent the summers in the Mirror Plateau and the winters in the Pelican Valley, and over time, those two herds learned to intermingle all by themselves. You could call that an assisted migration action. And I suppose I should pause there for a second, because I really think, and I've talked to a number of people about the idea of reinventing that assisted migration and helping the animals learn the landscape so that they can learn it more efficiently. In the 1930s, the Park Service gathered a couple groups of animals with a little bit of assisted immigration by truck and trailer. They introduced them to the Firehole Valley, to the Hayden Valley, and from there they grew to where they've learned their way around virtually the whole national park. There was a time when the animals explored and occupied the southwest corner of the state, or of the park rather, but as they migrated out into Idaho, that little subunit of the population disappeared in the 1970s. I think that those 20th century actions worked famously to speed the population's learning process and help them institute habits that we see today. And the most important habit that I think is available to them at this point in time is the habit of migration. If we give them a chance, they can migrate, they can explore, they can learn their way around more of the countryside. So to make a long story short, the population grew to 1,500 by the mid-1950s, grew to 2,000 by 1979, grew to 3,000 by 1985. You can see that increment is rapidly growing and the increment is shrinking. But by the early 1990s, the population abundance estimate was 4,000 animals. And that was the point that the state really flipped out. In the last 10 years, the average annual population abundance, 5,200 animals. So there has been a lot of good things that have been happening in order to get the population to grow to that level. Large snowfall winters along the way pushed small numbers of pioneering bulls to explore widely, learn the landscape more carefully, and migrations into the Gardner Basin are documented as early as the 1940s. Migrations to the west boundary started in 1980, 1981, along about that time, and they became much more routine by the end of that particular decade. This is when the state began to get worried, and the National Park Service started hearing more frequently, just keep your damn bison in the park. At the time, USDA was still really in the thick of their brucellosis eradication program. They'd spent many years reducing brucellosis abundance in livestock herds. They had reached the point where many states across the country were brucellosis free, and we were starting to finally focus on, or they were starting to focus on, the fact that this Yellowstone area, the greater Yellowstone area, still had brucellosis in the wildlife population, and it was going to be a problem to turn the country to a brucellosis-free status. But I think along the way, a lot of people have forgotten in this argument that it was the cattle that brought brucellosis to the area. When the pioneers came to explore the area, they brought their livestock with them, and there were along the way some animals that carried the little bacteria that created the brucellosis infection. While conflicts between Montana and the National Park Service date back 100 years, I do believe that it was that rapidly growing abundance and the time in which they reached 4,000 animals that generated sort of a higher level of conflict between the Park Service and the state of Montana. In 1995, Montana governor filed litigation against two federal agencies, arguing that the USDA was threatening to take away the state's precious brucellosis-free status if a single Yellowstone bison, that's the way it's written in the complaint, the legal argument, a single Yellowstone wild bison migrates into the state of Montana. So I scratched my head a lot on this. I think the challenge here is to figure out who was angry at who, as to why that litigation came forth. And my interpretation is that the USDA was angry at the Park Service. The Park Service in 1966 had put out a change in policy. They did a review of brucellosis eradication that they'd been working on for 30 years. And my former friend and colleague, Bill Barmore, wrote a nice report in '66 and said, look, test and slaughter, vaccination, it's a losing cause. The only real way to eliminate brucellosis in the population is to eliminate the elk and the bison and start all over. And the Park Service wasn't interested, starting all over 65 years into the restoration program. So let's see, there we go. It's important to note that Montana had gained their brucellosis-free status in 1985, so they'd had it for 10 years. But the sporadic migrations of bison into the state in the 1980s, and the really large push that happened in 1989 after the big fires, created a huge conflict. Hunters harvested 900 animals that year, and Montana got a black eye from killing all those animals. It went into the press. They couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle it, and they didn't want the bison to go any farther. So Montana's in that litigation. They sought really a zero-risk solution for their brucellosis dilemma, with the assumption that if the world could rid bison of Yellowstone from brucellosis, their hypothesis was it would simply fade away in the elk. It would just go away. That there wasn't enough of an R0, really. I mean, now that you know all about that, I can use that. But R0 was low enough that it would just disappear, and that was a false assumption. And that was really the root of many arguments for the Park Service against the state for at least 3 decades. The NPS appealed to the judge that was mediating the interagency planning process at the time, and pleaded that the state strategy was completely unreasonable. And so the state moved off of their zero tolerance strategy and were willing to accept a minuscule tolerance strategy, which didn't really change much. And if you remember at the time, I don't know how many of you all were here, in 1995 we were reintroducing wolves into the state of Montana and Yellowstone, and many in the leadership in the state really didn't like that restoration effort. So we all know that angst and anxiety breeds controversy, and finding common interest to develop some sort of compromise has been, always has been, and continues to be a big challenge. The 2000 Interagency Management Plan is a culmination of 2 negotiated settlements. It took them 2 to get through all of the litigation between the state and the feds. Yellowstone bison, let's see, and actually really it continues today. Management today is continuous, meeting after meeting of negotiation between the state and the park on how to implement a conservation program and let them roam farther on the landscape. And I really do think that society as a whole has forgotten how to live with bison. I mean, that's a key feature, of the big debate, and we need to kind of push that agenda forward as well. But there's a significant portion of Yellowstone, or of Montana citizens, that also argue that that continuous negotiation is necessary to prevent transmission of brucellosis from wildlife back to cattle. And I gotta repeat that the issue is that, and you have to acknowledge that cattle are the original source of brucella in the system. It was brought here when the early pioneers brought their livestock to the system. So I think the ranchers need to at least acknowledge and not just, blow it off that they solved a portion of the problem, but we haven't solved the whole problem. So there's a few recent, let's see, wrong one there. Here we go. So there's a few recent developments that benefit wild bison. And they effectively, and very effectively, I think, set the stage for future work. Well, I've already mentioned the Army and the Park Service been 130 years. We've been preserving the ecology of the system and even spending a little bit of capital, political capital in 2000 to advance bison restoration. There's a long list of folks to thank for their work in advancing this very first endangered species program. But recently, I think we need to acknowledge the Gallatin National Forest for pushing to include a place for wild bison on the National Forest, and they included it as a objective within their management plan. It was never, clearly stated before, but now it is. And the National Park Superintendent needs at least an acknowledgement for having the courage to advance a new bison management plan and study, even though it was limited to the analysis of just National Park Service lands and authority. Now, I was involved in the very beginning of that effort, and it was over a decade ago that the park went to the state and said, look, we need to update things. We got a lot of new information, a lot of those assumptions from 2000 that really don't hold muster anymore. But the state and the Park Service simply could not agree on reasonable alternatives. It was yet another stalemate that had occurred after several years of negotiating. So it kind of fell off the agenda, and Cam brought it back to the forefront. I think the best thing about all of those 2 efforts is a public conversation. The public weighed in, listened to all of their options, and provided a hell of a lot of comment to articulate that there's a great deal of support for bison on public lands. And that Gallatin National Forest could actually have a conservation program that's much more meaningful in the way of conservation than it was set up in the 2000 negotiated settlement. So accounting for all of that new information is important because it gets put into the public record and it gets utilized, and it can be reutilized for adjusting decisions in the future. So, in looking at those assumptions, okay, here we go. I got lost on the program here. The NPS spent a lot of political capital in 2000 to say, look, state of Montana, if you'll learn how to manage wild bison when they leave the national park, the Park Service will more aggressively cull or kill and and try and minimize the number of animals that the state had to learn how to manage. And the park was willing to say, look, you know, we'll help you along the way and go out and show you that it's not as hard as you think. But we're only going to do it when there's more than 3,000 animals. If you remember, or if you know anything at all about that negotiated settlement, the park committed to only do that when there was a $3,000 or 3,000 animals or more, and the park committed to studying the capacity of the system. That was a huge debate. That the state had argued that the park could only handle 500 bison, and the park said, no, it's more than that. And so the park committed to study the things like reproductive rates, forage production, migration patterns, all of those kinds of things that we now disclosed in that most recent document last year. And then Montana and the USDA agreed that they would not take away the state's brucellosis class 3 status if the park would recommit to consider eradicating brucellosis. And I never liked it, but it was a high-level political negotiation, and the park went back and said, all right, we'll look at it one more time. We'll look at the new information. And on top of all of that, the park had to commit to only seeing animals migrate into those tiny little zones that I described on the map earlier in the program. Well, that negotiated settlement was intended to be simply the beginning of an adaptive management learning model that would allow the state to learn in small increments and then let bison begin to use the landscape, you know, in greater and greater numbers down the road as the state became more comfortable at learning how to manage. Well, that didn't happen. So I want to share just a little bit about some of that new information that was put forward, because I think it's important for everybody to understand. The EIS describes 34 changed circumstances and 38 topics of information that we either disputed in 2000 or we had no information and we had to throw out assumptions. So some of those examples include 9 peer-reviewed publications on top of the National Academy of Sciences review that said elk are the primary risk of brucellosis transmission to wild bison, or to cattle, excuse me. And the wild bison are really minuscule in comparison as far as risk to cattle. Brucellosis is maintained in elk even in the absence of commingling with bison. So for many years, Montana spin doctors have pushed the belief that Yellowstone bison were the source, the primary source of reinfection by brucellosis to the livestock. And you know what I have to say about that, the cattle, or the big reintroduction. So on top of all of that, seropositive females are really, in fact, after they go through the infection, they're resistant to the disease. So it's not as bad. It's not as bad as it was declared back in the early days in that negotiated settlement, or even in the lawsuit. Also, there's 2 separate studies that were funded by APHIS that determined male bison are not a transmission vector. You know, we argued that. Everybody's argued that for ages. Well, there's been studies to document that quarantine is feasible and that seronegative bison are not necessarily, you know, a threat and don't need to be slaughtered at all. We also know that the current state of technology is incapable of producing vaccines, vaccine delivery systems that will vaccinate wild bison against brucellosis. So the Park Service told everybody again a second time in 2014, it's not worth doing it. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. On top of all of that, we spent a lot of time studying the ecological capacity of the system. In 2000, there was that huge debate. I told you, 500 animals is what many in the state argued. The Park Service argued 3,000 or 4,000 is probably more likely, but you know, capacity of the system is a variable. You know, and biologists have been arguing about, you know, how that is a variable for ages. My successors are continuing to study forage production, capacity of the system in the grasslands, and we found that the grasslands can produce far greater numbers of bison because of the amount of available forage than was thought in 2000. I've heard someone throw out 10,000. I mean, that's probably realistic for a summer-only kind of estimate. Things kind of change once the snow shows up. And the wild cards are, like I said, migratory behavior of all the animals, as well as the abundance of the other species on the landscape at the time. So Capacity, ecological capacity is a variable. And then I think one of the most important things that came about since 2000 is that USDA developed a designated surveillance area. They did that, I think it was in 2010, 15 years ago. So the designated surveillance area roughly coincides with the area of distribution of wild brucellosis infected elk. So that is a good thing for us. I've laid out a lot here about how conflicts in migrating bison are complicated. I heard someone else say that it's complicated. It really is. Tribal constituents, conservation groups, most of us probably here this evening would like to see more bison on a wider landscape. It just makes sense. State of Montana wants to limit numbers of bison outside the park so that they have to do little to no management. I mean, the reality is they just don't want to do the work. Livestock groups want no bison outside the park. In fact, a bunch of the livestock groups want less bison in the park. So that debate's going to rage on forever. So now's kind of where I'd like to put some of my recommendations forth, kind of the meat of the program that Jared asked me to talk about. I used to say, my whole career, I told this to my staff, my bosses, everybody. Anything is possible to those who don't have to do any of the real work. So I think that that's something that everybody needs to consider. Managing wild bison, preserving wild bison is probably one of the hardest species to tackle. But I do think, instead of going around in circles and having the same day every day, I think that we as citizens of Montana need to be the change. Change up our approach in order to help the Gallatin National Forest realize their objective of more bison on forest lands. I do think that that's the next step in wild bison restoration. Find a way to let them utilize that space that they have available to them in Montana. Montana is simply not engaging. We need to try to get bison back under the sole jurisdiction of fish, wildlife, and parks. I think it's time for a divorce. The current state of population, I probably better acknowledge that. Catherine sent me that article like 15 years ago, and I said, yeah, I think you're right. We should have 15 years ago. So the current state of the population is such that there is capacity to pioneer more of our public lands, because we know that Montana is learning to live with brucellosis. Look at their elk management plan. We got elk all over the designated surveillance area, and they have brucellosis. USDA has backed off considerably in their threats to take away the state's brucellosis-free status. And there's a significant portion of the public that supports wild bison on public lands. Numerous tribal communities now have the opportunity to harvest wild bison like their ancestors did. Not necessarily the same way, or in the same abundance, but a part of their culture has been restored because we've restored wild bison to the Yellowstone landscape. So we've solved many of the conflicts that seemed really important to the state of Montana governance in the 1990s. So now we can focus on some new challenges, and I guess I would have to say to all of the groups that spoke ahead of us, keep the charge going, because all of the things that you've done up to this point, we still need to do into the future. We just need to find a few different things to throw into the mix. The belief that Yellowstone bison are the source of the potential threat of reinfection by brucellosis to livestock in the GYA is short-sighted and it's biased. Cattle migration into the system when Euro-Americans settled Montana are the original source, and so to ignore that responsibility is irresponsible. We have to remember the facts and understand the complicated dynamics of the brucellosis bureaucracy. We could let's see now, I can move on to that. Oh, it's blinking. I'm not sure what happened.
We're having some technical issues.
Obviously some technical issues.
Back now.
We must have lost a cord or something. Oh, great. Great. It's still working, isn't it? All right. So where was I here? So we can recognize that the state wants to remain brucellosis free, so it is easier to market their livestock. Now that's a lot easier for them to do. USDA established that designated surveillance zone where brucellosis can be actively managed in the livestock. So I ask, is it reasonable to say that wild bisons should be afforded the same area to roam since the state will not lose class 4 status until they leave the designated surveillance area? And brucellosis in infected elk are allowed to roam that very same part of the state. I think it's reasonable. Montana state leadership propagates the perspective that bison destroy fences and compete with cattle for grass in the larger open valleys of the West. If we need a fence, let's build better fences. And really, grass is actually not a limiting factor for farmers and ranchers in Montana. Let's develop a citizen initiative to help Montana be responsible with our wildlife legacy. The list of things that I think are important to consider and utilize in your comments when you talk to the right people is work with our neighbors to solve conflicts where conflicts occur. We don't need a big zone to say where things need to occur. Many assumptions from 2000, the settlement agreement, were disproved by further research. So reach out and request that Montana update the management strategy they implement to reflect all that new information. As Park Service did, as Forest Service did, I think it's time for Montana to do the same. Manage wild bison like we manage the rest of our wildlife population so that we can be proud of the legacy we are protecting for the future. Engage, communicate with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Tell them to seize back wildlife management lead for bison conservation. Ask them to seek balance between ecology of the environment, economy of our society, and the social aspects of how we share the greater Yellowstone with each other, with the wildlife that live here, and the millions of visitors that come here each year to watch our wildlife. Because we still have wild bison, and few other locations do. Be sure to vote for the kind of leaders that will further bison conservation and help us find ways to coexist with wild bison on public lands. Choose ethical and responsible businesses and brands that protect wild bison and solve conflicts that they face today. There's a couple of other groups that I think are valuable to communicate with. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has what they call citizens advisory groups. They have them in each region. Reach out and talk to your representative on the Citizens Advisory Group. I think they're spread out throughout the region, so there should be one person that lives nearby where you live. Reach out to the Wildlife Commission. That commission is appointed by the governor, but they need to hear. They need to hear that there's a lot of people in Montana that would like to see wild bison on public land. So our time here on Earth is short. Technically, we're temporary residents. In order to show respect for the natural world and the life forms that have evolved here, we must change the way we do business to support the sustainability of human life. Conservation of wildlife is a legacy type action, and we must all find a way to contribute. I think that's all I had to share tonight, and I made it through with one glitch.